Sorry, I have my own timer because of that. Okay. So first of all, thank you so much for having me at this conference. I am really excited to present some preliminary results from my research. So this research is kind of personal to me because I experienced firsthand the difficulties of my own mother struggling to get her credentials recognized as a dietitian in Canada. She had to go back to school while working full time and experience a lot of racism in the process. And this is, a very typical immigrant story. However, unlike the vast majority of immigrants, my mother did manage to eventually get her license. And after speaking through around like a dozen immigrants, I think it was because, we were a double income household and my brother and I were old enough that we didn't require childcare anymore. And we also came as permanent migrants. But as I said, for the vast majority of immigrants, this is not the case. Around in 2001, Galabuzzi estimated that over 90% of those who failed to integrate into the professions within the first 3 years of immigration ended up permanently in other fields. So my research is looking at one small but important segment of those people, in this case, the internationally educated nurses or IENS, and who are working as PSWs. But because personal support work is done across multiple job titles, there's no such job titles as PSW in the National Occupational Classification. I looked at those who were working in low status care provision in general. So just a quick overview, although it's difficult to calculate the exact numbers of IENs because of their multiple entry pathways, it's estimated around 17,000 entered in 2011. This is evenly split in terms of permanent and temporary visas. And of particular note here is that they make up around 11% of international students. And this is, as the government is transitioning out of the live-in caregiver and the caregiver programs, this is an increasingly popular route because it allows these migrant nurses to have their partners here with an open work permit, and it also allows their children to be here. Most of these nurses are women. Over half of them come to Ontario, and over half of them, or just under half of them come to Ontario, and over half of them come from the Philippines. So although they make up a growing percentage of the nursing workforce, it was 8.9% in 2020. This is a relatively small number compared to the percentage of internationally educated physicians, who make up around 22% of that workforce. And this is also not a number that has shifted that much. In spite of a series of government initiatives to improve the numbers, it only went up around less than 2%, and that's from like 8 years ago. So why is this happening? Well, we know that about a third of them are successful within a year of applying to licensure, compared to about 2/3 of Ontario educated nurses. And only about 50% pass the exam the first time, compared to around 90% of Ontario educated nurses. So it's really difficult for them to get their license. And as a result of them, many end up in low status care work. We don't know exactly how many, but I've sort of compiled different studies to show you that their numbers are significant. There was a StatsCan study in 2020, which showed that they made up around 11% of so-called unregulated care providers. A survey of 75 home care workers showed that around half of them were internationally educated nurses. And there was another study that said that close to 80% of those doing domestic work in Canada had a bachelor's degree. That wasn't disaggregated to say nurses, but needless to say, it shows that they are making up a lot of this low status care workforce. So what are the implications of this? Well, the implications of this is that these nurses are being prevented from accessing, so-called good jobs, although I would say they're not so good, but just better. They have better pay, they have better protections, they have better status. which is, this is not something that's just happening to migrant nurses, but immigrants as a whole. It's been shown that despite their levels of education, they are twice as likely to be low income. The other implication of this is of this downward occupational mobility is that if by failing to integrate them into the nursing workforce, it's exacerbating this perceived nursing shortage. And I put that in quotations because it's not a shortage per se, it's not a problem of supply, but rather it's a lot of it is people leaving nursing because of the worsening working conditions in that workforce. So in any case, so this problem of downward occupational mobility is one that has been recognized for a long time in the literature, in the policies. It's often referred to as brain waste, which is this process of underutilization or even descaling of these nurses. And it's understood in terms of like labor market exclusion, with the lack of the recognition of their foreign credentials as being the key factor of their exclusion. As a result, as I mentioned, there's been a series of initiatives and task force and committees and studies and reports, all of them sort of examining this attempt to address these barriers to foreign credential recognition. So these barriers are generally fall within these categories in the policies. There's this idea, there's this disjuncture in the policies. Immigration policies doing one thing, labor policies doing the other, the regulatory bodies are doing another. And there's another one is that there's lack of clear information in terms of how to go about getting your license. Part of this is this disjuncture. The perceived difficulty in assessing foreign credentials as the attempt to balance the demands for public safety and also respect, international agreements which demand that the process is fair. And also a lot of it is cost. Although sadly, the dominant approach has now been just to simply provide access to microloans rather than, public education, but okay. Okay, so although the examination of barriers is important because it reveals a lot about why migrant nurses have had a hard time with integration, I believe there's a lot of problems with this approach. I think it's ultimately assimilationist. It pushes IENS, these migrant nurses, to conform to these normative criteria that are like rooted in problematic notions of skill. I think that the policy solutions have not meaningfully improved their access to the nursing workforce, even though millions of dollars have been dedicated to this problem. But instead, it has worked to uphold the treatment of difference as deficiency or as risk rather than something valuable. And it does not address the nursing crisis, but rather makes it worse because it increases the reliance on these cheap workers, which in turn has implications for the nursing workforce. It creates a downward pressure on their own wages and conditions. And in turn has implications for the entire healthcare system. So how is my approach different? So I draw from feminist political economy, and disablement, which understands disability not as a given, but as produced through these interlocking oppressive forces of like capitalism, white supremacy, etc. So rather than understanding skill as individual, independent, and objective capacities with an intrinsic worth, I consider these series of forces that shape its construction. So as I trace the journey of these migrant nurses, I start with a question of who is determined to come, how skill is used to determine who can enter Canada, under what circumstances. I also look at the devaluation, the invisibilization of social reproduction and care work, the treatment of foreign credentials as deficiency, as risky, and the way that this is used, as Tovani would say, to leverage or to exalt whiteness. And in terms of downward occupational mobility, you have the exclusion, as I said, of better jobs with less exposure to risk and better compensation and protections. And more broadly, as I mentioned, the implications on the healthcare system in terms of enabling neoliberal restructuring with an emphasis on cost effectiveness and performance. And of course, the exodus of migrant nurses has an impact on their home countries. It exacerbates their own nursing crisis over there, and this is known as care drain. And I also use this methodology. It's called What's the Problem approach. It's a critical policy analysis approach. And so instead of assessing policies in terms of their success at solving societal problems, I think we need to take a step back and think about how policy institutionalizes a certain set of relations by the way they present certain problems. In other words, using these guiding questions, I look at like how policies ascribe meaning to problems and how they crudely assess possible policy solutions. So these are some guiding questions that I pulled from Baki. And, these set of questions challenge us to think about the underlying assumptions in terms of how problems are conceptualized, the history of these constructions, what is silence, the effects in terms of how we think about the problem on the lived experiences of these migrant nurses, and also think about alternative ways to approach this. And just quickly, I used a mixed method approach. I did interviews of migrant nurses, of representatives from regulatory bodies, assessment agencies. I also doing this massive documentary analysis. I have like 1,000 documents. It's a little overwhelming, but anyway. Quickly moving on. So the underutilization and mismatch of skills, as I said, is a recognized problem in the policies, right? And so one of these problems is like, as I said, this disjuncturing policies. There's this idea that there's a jurisdictional complexity and a lack of coordination among these different stakeholders. And this is understood basically as a result of like the division of powers, the growing complexity of public services, public provision of services, and the lack of information sharing and coordination among all of these. So therefore, the solution that comes to this is like, we're going to harmonize policy by creating some sort of formal like central agencies and improve information sharing, and ironically just make more agencies and bureaucracy more complex somehow. So what are some of the underlying assumptions here? Well, this complexity is treated as a given. It's treated as just sort of this, as a result of these various sort of pluralist players attempting to advance these contradictory interests. But there's very little analysis of like of the complexity in terms of like how these various governance bodies came to be about, like what their purpose was, what kind of power relationships did they reproduce, or what kind of power relationships they were a response to, and how exactly they're producing the disablement of these nurses, and I think of everyone more generally. So in terms of regulatory bodies, they emerge as a means to institutionalize the status of nurses, right? The regulatory body is the one who determines the College of Nurses of Ontario. It creates a monopoly over the skills of nurses. It handles the licensing process. It protects their scope of practice, what they're allowed to do, what they can or are allowed to do. And it puts standards in place to protect the public, although this seems to be more about managing liability, really. So in this context, these migrant nurses are considered this sort of like invasive element, right? Because they're seen as like they're trying to displace domestic nurses who are themselves actually being displaced by, capitalism and like this supply and demand approach to this nursing shortage. They're being displaced by neoliberal policies of austerity and privatization, right? Especially this distinction in healthcare policy that it divides essential and ancillary health services. It considers it ancillary as something that can be provided by the private sector. It doesn't consider it as essential, which in turn relies on this feminization of care work, right? These nurses are also being displaced by performance-driven models, which emphasize all kinds of like performance indicators, and it also has impact on the division of labor in healthcare, right? Because it creates a greater and greater need for these sort of lower tiered workers, such as personal support workers, as nurses supposedly are being sort of channeled to do real nursing work, which is like not what personal support workers do, because that's somehow beneath the nurse to make a bed. And this treatment of treating foreign credentials as a risk and to treat them with suspicion, I think it's also kind of not hilarious, but interesting that it's, it wasn't until 1999 that in Ontario, you require a bachelor's degree to be a nurse, right? So somehow Canadian nurses weren't required to have a bachelor's degree until the early 2000s, but somehow like, nurses from the Philippines with 4-year degree, bachelor degrees are, the real problem here. And then, in terms of this proliferation of all these agencies, right? There's all kinds of assessments agencies, language assessment. There's been this creation of this massive market for foreign credential recognition, which adds to this complexity. And part of this was a response to these international agreements that demand that, the assessments be made and that they be fair. But it's also, a demand for the validation of these foreign credentials in a quicker way. Oop, I'm really out of time now. So I'll be quick, 1 more minute. So just really quickly, and then this idea of like that assessing foreign credentials is time and labor consuming. As I mentioned, it treats the IENS with suspicion, but it also reduces fairness as just a matter of procedural fairness, right? It's not about, it's not about like, it pays little attention to the colonial and sort of like racist evaluation of foreign credentials, not only for their perceptions of inferiority, but also, the deterioration of public services in the global South is due to globalization and the international division of labor. Like this doesn't happen out of nowhere. And so again, just reducing fairness to a matter of like individualized, like procedural justice, just completely neglects any of these sort of like structural factors at play. This is my last slide. And so just generally, I think that we need to challenge this notion of brain waste, right? Like, what does it really mean to say that their nurses' skills are being wasted? In my interviews, I noticed that these migrant nurses, like, they are using their skills as nurses, right? They are diagnosing patients, obviously not technically because they're not allowed to, but they are taking care of them using their knowledge and using their training. And, they have literally, I have someone who like convinced the family to go get their grandparent checked because she noticed that there was something wrong with him. And he ended up having like a brain tumor, right? There's all these kinds of instances where these nurses are sort of just like, that all of these sort of conditions wouldn't be caught if it wasn't for these nurses having this training. And so I think as a general, like constructing these migrant nurses and the work of personal support work in general as low skilled is a way to, make them hyper exploitable. It makes them like sort of like a shock absorbers of healthcare restructuring. And so ultimately, I think that is a form of disablement. So downward occupational mobility is disablement, not only is not a form of exclusion, a labor market exclusion, is a form of differential inclusion because it leverages their evaluation and their disablement to exalt certain citizen subjects, in this case, Canadians. And it also, in terms of their racialization and their precarious status, it complicates their own status as disabled and their own claims to disability as well. Sorry, I went over time. I'm going to end it there.